Manuel, that's what I was just trying to say in my long-worded version. So even if you're not directly in scope, you have to get ready, because those who have to report, they have to report about you. So so that's, where you're not safe just because.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk Series brought to you by AKFI Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry consortium committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. My name is Isabella. I am the co-host here with Manuel, another co-host, also the executive director at AKFI, and our old friend, our special guest today, Alexandra. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Isabella and Manuel, for having me. Pleasure to be back. Yes. Thanks.
Exciting to hear everything you have to share today. A little bit about Alexandra to our audience who haven't met her yet. Currently, Alexandra is a partner in EU/UK competition and regulatory law at Keystone Law in London, and also Liberius Legal in Brussels. And Alexandra advises business of all sizes on successful navigating through and optimal use of the EU and UK regulatory framework for a sustainable digital transformation. And she's also a very successful book author. One of her book, it's won the annual book award from one of the largest publisher of German-speaking legal publications. We have a lot of going on today because we talked a little bit before, so I want to leave the most of time to Alexandra. Please tell us, what do you want to tell us the most to start our conversation today?
Oh, thanks, Isabella. Yeah, I mean, last time we talked about updates at EU level in relation to sustainability, but also digital regulation. Just because, how we've tailored the session and how things flow at the moment at EU level, I think it would be most beneficial to focus on the sustainability framework and what's happened here. Just a quick update on what's happened on the most important, what I consider the most important tools and frameworks at EU level when it comes to sustainability. Just a little reminder, we all remember, sustainability, or ESG, which is very often used interchangeably. That's that's not new. That's existed for a long time, but it got a different driver, one would say, when the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, but not only based on this, but I'd say to large part based on this, the EU came up with the Green Deal in 2019, which is a major framework under which the EU says that's how we're committing to the SDGs and also the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, so achieving net zero. So that's something that the EU Commission has very heavily focused on, and numerous various instruments. It's fair to say, to provide a general overview, that they have first very much focused on climate and the green aspects of the SDGs, and that has branched out in recent years and focused also more on the social aspects, looking into, for example, supply chain due diligence and what comes with this, and also the governance factor. So upcoming, at least, increased obligations and responsibilities for directors. So, and that's why I wanted to focus on these bits today. So, sustainability framework and what's coming and what's already been adopted in this sphere. So, and in particular, on what will not be new to anyone, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, and where we are with this, but also the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, so CSRD, which is in the making at the moment. So these are the two things I'd be glad to touch upon today.
Absolutely, and I know, in the interest of time, let's start. please point also to some critical dates, both in new legislation as well as implementation of current legislations, maybe starting with January 1st, 2024. I think it's an important date in the calendar. But please continue.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, coming to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, so the CSRD. So when we last spoke, I'm not sure, I think it had just been adopted, so it entered into force. It's a directive which provides a framework for EU member states, so that needs to be implemented because it's a directive and it provides a framework how companies must report going forward in relation to ESG, or what's called sustainability. And so that entered into force at the beginning of this year after, it was part of the Sustainable Financial Package of the Commission in 2021, because it was seen that there is a need to have a common reporting standard, sustainability reporting standard for companies. And by companies, I'm going to come to this later, I don't only mean EU companies above certain thresholds, but also, importantly, for those who are listening in from other parts in the world, also what we call third country companies under certain conditions, so in particular if certain financial thresholds are exceeded or met, and there is activity in the EU. So in that case, you will also, a bit convoluted, but there are different ways and possibilities how the CSRD can apply to non-EU companies, is what I'm trying to say. We won't lack the time to go into the nitty-gritty here, but just as a word of caution, so it does not only apply to EU companies. And so where we are with this, so it entered into force at the beginning of this year. So member states have now 2 years to implement that directive. And that was needed because it was seen there is no common reporting standard, which is difficult for investors, because they can't compare data. And therefore they can't make a viable investment decision. And investing into green is a vital part of the Green Deal strategy. But it was also seen necessary for other reasons. So also, third-party organizations want to understand what companies are doing or not doing in relation to sustainability. Consumers. So there is a need for transparency and comparability of data. And so that's how this CSRD came about. As I said, member states now have 2 years as of beginning of this year to implement it. But in parallel, what the Commission has done, it has worked on what we call these European sustainable reporting standards. So these are standards where, the nitty-gritty of what things need to be reported on has been set out, at least for a certain type of company. So in very generic terms. So this is the first set of standards. It applies in more general terms. There will be other standards also for SMEs and also for third country companies. But so this is the first step. And that was adopted in July only, after a lot of going back and forth between EFRAG, so there's an organization that was appointed to provide a draft between them and the Commission consulted member states and the public on the standards as well. So now we have the first set of standards. And again, so what's very important to understand about sustainability reporting at EU level is it does take what we call a double materiality approach. So very important, because that is quite different, although there are, now convergences and, things, people are trying to make things more interoperable, but it's the only standard worldwide, at least at an official level, that says, okay, we do not only want to know how, for example, climate change, how that impacts on the financial viability of your business. So that's what we call inward materiality. So you don't only want to know what the climate does to your business. So, for example, what happens if there's a drought and you are producing agricultural products in the area where there will be a drought. or what happens if you need to consume water, and that will be a problem to access water in the future. So for drinks companies, for example, that's not the only question. The question that is at least as material is, what is your impact as a company on the outside world? And so there, the European standards, they do not only focus on the climate, as many other standards do, and what's your impact on climate, but they also focus on the S, so for example, workforce, and on the G, so governance. And so that's really important to bear in mind. And as I said, we now have the first set, which came out not long ago. And so I won't go into the nitty-gritty because we don't have the time. But so again, important to bear in mind, so these are is the first set of general standards, and there are general requirements. So so SRES 1, for example, sets general principles to be applied when reporting according to these standards, and does not itself set specific disclosure requirements, so that applies to everyone. But then you have the general disclosure set out in SRES 2, and so they specify essential information to be disclosed. And so that is, you know, something that I urge people, they should have a look at, because it is, you know, it is a standard that applies in the EU going forward. And you asked, Manu, what are the timescales? So the timescales are staggered. So there is a first wave of companies, and they, so these are those who already fall under the existing reporting mechanism at EU level, which is, however, much less far-reaching as the one that we have now, where we're looking into double materiality, but also into the framework as such is enormous, but also the granular detail of what I just said. Looking into this, you will find that, you know, there's a lot to be assessed also in relation to other parts of the reporting standard. You need to apply materiality. So is that a material aspect or not? And if it isn't, then you have to explain why in most cases. So that is something, you know, to absolutely get into. Even if you're not part of wave one, as I said, so these are the companies, large entities, what we call special interest entities, so that are already subject to the already existing non-financial reporting directive, NFRD. And so this is the first wave, and they, well, I hope they're all prepared, because that starts in a couple of months' time, that they will have to, you know, have the data, collect the data. They will have to report on 2025. So they will have to report on 2024 data. The next wave is then the large companies who do not fall under the NFRD. So that's the next wave. They're going to have to report on, you know, 2024 data in 2025. And then so it goes on, and we're going to have the SMEs reporting on 2026 data in 2027. And then we're going to have the non-EU companies who will have to report in 2029 and 2028 data. So it's staggered, and different reporting standards apply, but it's starting as of January 2024 for the first wave. So, and so again, so it would be great if we could go into the nitty-gritty of who falls under which baskets here, but we will lack the time. But just to understand, so it really impacts not only EU companies, but also non-EU companies and also SMEs. Yeah, so listed ones in any event. And if you think about it, looking at the reporting standards, because it's so far-reaching what you have to report about, suppliers, whether they are in scope or not, they will have to have that data ready as well, because if they're part of a supply chain, that data will be needed by those who are in scope. So obviously, there is therefore an indirect obligation of the CSRD to companies, even if they're not in scope or not yet in scope. So in other words, those who are not yet in scope because they're not based in, not headquartered in the EU, that doesn't mean they shouldn't get ready now. Because if they're part of a supply chain, and if you look if you look into the reporting framework, it starts now. It starts in 2024. So if you're part of that supply chain, you have to get the data ready. And that
Very
requires.
Important point. And I know we are short on time, but if you have any presentation or document that we can point to, and we can share it with the people listening to us, please send it by email to us later, and we'll make sure it's distributed. Because all these data, I understand.
As to timescales?
The time scale, if you
yes, yeah, very happy to. Yes, of course. Yeah.
I think that will make it clearer also, because it's a little bit confusing to follow all these dates. But
yes,
I heard one theme, which is get your data in order. If you don't get your data in order and understand how you have to report, because the framework has to be aligned or unified, then. So I think getting data ready, it's important. And I'll have a following question. Most of the Scope 3 reporting is based on the supply chain. So although the supply chain and the SME seems to be farther remote in time from reporting, they have to roll up their Scope 3 into the companies that must report. So any comment on that?
But exactly, I wouldn't only say get your data ready. I would say you need to understand what data you need in the first instance. What is the data you need? And that also, that requires two things: understanding what data might potentially be asked from you, looking at the framework. That's why I said earlier, I'm urging people to have a look, or to get familiar with this, because you need to understand what data might be required, and then depending on whether you're directly in scope or you're part of a supply chain, you need to understand to what extent that data needs to be made available, is readily available, and if it's not readily available, how you can get it. Whether it is because you're in scope and you therefore need to understand whose data you need, who's not part of your own, company. So that's one, way of viewing things. But the other way, as we discussed, is obviously those who are part of a supply chain. They will have to look into it, because this data will have to be asked from them. And as we all know, I mean, that is an essential part of supplying goods or services, is to make life not most difficult for the one who's buying the goods and services. So that's where it comes in at different points.
I will scare the audience now, because this data also has to be subject to audits. So it's not only the way you put it together, but also the fact that you have to produce it in a format that the auditors can understand quickly, verify, and so on. So I think that's almost another.
Yeah. No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, we could go into the reasons why you need to have that data and identify which one you need, have it ready in time, and all this. You're absolutely right, Manuel. I mean, there is, even initially, if we say only, there is, a limited audit, and that can branch out to higher standards. So absolutely. So what you say is absolutely important and right. The data is not only an exercise as before under the NFID, where I can say, I'm looking, I don't have it. I can tell you why, because the reason is I was too busy. So that won't be sufficient anymore. You have to have the data. So that's absolutely true. And the data must be, will be subject to audit, even initially. So
and eventually fines if the audit fails, right? So there is a stick and carrot as well into. Of course, the carrot is that once you set the right reporting mechanism and so on, you have a much better, much more manageable company and industry as a whole. So there are advantages also in following this.
There are. Indeed. Yes, there are. But Harry, I mean, it's such a highly interesting topic. And I mean, obviously, we shouldn't only focus on the supply chain. We should say lending, for example, has become super difficult if you don't have certain data available for the banks.
Absolutely. You are a risk. You are a risk, measured up to 4% of your gross revenue, right?
Exactly. So, yeah. So I think this is what I find a little bit of a shame. The why, is actually the most important bit. Why do we collect this data and why should you have it? So it's two things. There's almost like double materiality. Why does the EU wants you to collect this data and do something with it and have certain transition plans? That's one thing, why. And the other why is why should you as a company have it? So it's a bit like inward and outward materiality, really. So the two sides materiality. You need it to keep your company afloat. And to summarize, I think everybody's got a good reason to collect the data.
And we need to reserve time for data only and AI and the discussion on that. Definitely, we want to invite you back for that. I know we compressed in a very short time all the challenges and the timelines, and as I said, hopefully we can follow with the presentation or distribute it to the people that are listening to us. So
I did send you something with timelines in it, Mario, so it would be ready to be distributed. I mean, we could also just focus on this bit, obviously, of course, but happy to do so. Maybe just very briefly on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, just because I think, as I mentioned, it's really important, I think, because that goes further than just reporting. It branches out into the doing. So it's not only what I'm reporting after report, about sustainability, but I have to do. So, and that's currently still in the making. So it's currently being discussed between the two legislators, so the European Parliament and the Council of the EU, with the Commission participating on what's called tripartite negotiations, because there are suggested changes by both the EU Parliament and the Council on the text that the Commission proposed, the legislative text. So, and so that's what's currently happening. But as a ground principle, so the basic principle is that this Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive does require companies, as I said, to do more than just report. So they do need to have, they have those who are in scope, and this is again is under disputation who's in scope or not. The Parliament wants to have a very wide scope of application. So those who are in scope, they need to, have identify and have policies in their own operations, in the operations of their subsidiaries, but also in their value chain. And there again, there's a little under discussion. What is value chain? Is that upstream and downstream, as the Parliament wants it to be? Is it only upstream and not downstream, as the Council has suggested? So there's a little bit of a dispute. But what we do know is not only your own operation; it's going to be wider, much wider. And it's also relating to business partners. But depending on where they sit, we're going to see. But so an obligation to identify and mitigate risks and negative impacts on, certain environmental factors and human rights. And so again, the scope is not very clear yet how wide that will be, but clearly it's not only the E, it's also the S. So it clearly also includes human rights, and it includes, governance aspects, especially when it comes to the EP position. And so that will come probably only at the beginning of next year, but then it will come, and then member states will only have, the shortest will be 2 years from entry into force to implement the directive. And the directive, so there are similar laws, especially in Germany and France, but they are not as far-reaching, especially when it comes to the consequences of getting it wrong. So under that directive, you will have to have the potential possibility of fines, also collective redress, so damages claims. So it will have much more teeth, or power, if you like, also when it comes to enforcement, than other instruments. So it requires to do, and if you don't, then that's going to have stark consequences for you. And so there are many other, obligations in that directive. For example, to have a mandatory transition, a climate transition plan. So setting out how companies intend to achieve net zero. And so if the parliament gets its way, so that is going to apply to all companies in scope. So again, so quite, not only a report about whether you have one, but you have to have one. And then that also then obviously means just looking at recent court cases, Again, here, you're going to have a basis on which you will have to be compared. People will be able to assess very openly and clearly, because all this will be very transparent. People will be able to assess how you, how you're doing when it comes to achieving net zero. So there are quite a few pearls in that, and we won't have the time to go through all of them. But again, so mandatory transition plan for at least certain in scope companies, also the responsibility of directors will potentially be quite high under that directive, whereas it's still under discussion to what extent. But I think one thing is very clear to say there will be increased responsibility of company directors. So that's definitely one to watch. As I said, so they're still in the making, but sure it's going to be ready, maybe not this year, but beginning of next year. I
hear this connecting to one strategy and implementation of strategy to the other, and we can leave it for a different talk, but it connects back to double materiality, if I understand correctly.
Indeed, absolutely, yes. So, and so that's the recurrent theme is really coming from the EU, is we're looking into not only the financial viability, but the impact on the outer world of companies. So it's quite groundbreaking, because it will require companies to engage in a completely different way.
And again, reinforcing what you said a couple of times, companies affected are not only companies operating in Europe. There are global companies, there are international companies. They can be in the supply chain, small, medium businesses that they get involved in the reporting as well. So just reinforcing what you said. And
absolutely. And important point, Manuel, also the due diligence, because it's not quite clear yet how they're going to phrase this, but there is a mechanism where you can impose, by contract, certain obligations on your contractors. So, and you will have to when, if a certain version gets its way. So it's far-reaching.
I would like to turn back to Isabella a little bit, if she has any question.
Oh, this is great. I think we definitely need a follow-up conversation. We're barely covering half of our discussion point yet, but thank you so much, Alexandra. What's your takeaway for today to wrap up the conversation?
Well, I think the takeaway for me is, and thank you again for having me, is things are developing at a speed which is breathtaking. I think quite a few things still need to be sorted, how this is working, how interoperability. I mean, a lot has been done to ensure that there is some form of interoperability with other standards. But all that needs to come together somehow. And it also needs to, how we're getting the data. Also, does this fit into the data framework? You know, and to what extent can companies collaborate, competitors, to see how they're doing, what they need, what needs to be improved. All these things are fascinating. And it will eventually fall together because it will have to fall together. Just looking, you know, at the global risk report but yeah, so there's a lot to take in, as you say, Isabella. We haven't even touched on digital regulation, which also is, developing with the highest speed, as you will know, Isabella, in particular. But there's a lot to take in. It's absolutely vital to take it in and to get familiar and to see how this fits or applies to each and every one.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra. And thank you all for joining us today. To our audience, make sure to tuning in every week for a new episode of AKFI's Actionable ESG Talk Series, where you can gain new perspective on how to mitigate risk and create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation. Until next week, bye for now. Bye, Manuel. Bye, Alexandra.
Bye,
Alexandra. Bye, Isabella. And see you soon
Isabella.
again.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thanks.